What he's going to talk about. Stephen, your title is, you take it away.
Thank you very much. My title, Richard Wagner, Camillo Sitte, and the Modern Slow Movement. Part of my dissertation dealt with Wagner's influence on architects, especially the famous Viennese architect Camillo Sitte. It's only recently that I've tried to connect all of this with modern attempts at improving everyday life, modern urban planning, and the broader slow movement. So I look forward to questions and suggestions on how I might improve the project, or just reactions to this connection. One of Richard Wagner's goals in developing the Bioriod Festival was to recreate the spirit of ancient Athenian dramatic festivals, in which an entire community immersed itself in art that reflected its deepest values. As a substitute for ancient Athens, festival-goers experienced performances over several days in a small town far from the traffic and distractions of larger cities. The auditorium of the Festspielhaus was designed to offer excellent sightlines to all attendees and to ensure that their focus remained on the stage by hiding the orchestra and partially dimming the lights. Wagner's emphasis on the communal nature of the Gesamtkunstwerk and the communal experience of art influenced the Viennese architect, painter, and theoretician Camillo Sitte. This paper considers Wagner's influence on Sitte, on his treatise City Planning According to Artistic Principles, first published in 1889, and the continuing relevance of these ideas for the modern slow movement. Sitte attempted to counteract the alienating effects of modern urban landscapes designed according to a rigid grid system of uniform city blocks by praising older cities that had developed slowly over time. Many of these cities featured asymmetrical public plazas that invited community interaction and the appreciation of architectural, sculptural, and pictorial art found in or around them. Modern attempts to slow the pace of life and preserve cultural and artistic traditions, such as the slow food movement and slow city, demonstrate a commitment to community and a resistance to the homogenization of an increasingly globalized world culture that reflect the spirit of Wagner and Sitte. Camillo Sitte was an influential Viennese architect, painter, and theoretician. His most significant publication, again, Der Städtebau nach seinen künstlerischen Grundsätzen of 1889. His father was architect Franz Sitte, whose biggest project in Vienna was the completion of the Alt-Lerchenfeld church after the untimely death of the original architect, Johann Georg Müller. This project was part of a larger trend around the middle of the 19th century towards Germanic, medieval-inspired styles and away from a more Renaissance-inspired classical one. At the University of Vienna, Camillo studied art history, archaeology, and medicine. In addition to his publishing activities, he organized and directed the new State School of Applied Arts in Vienna from 1883 until his death in 1903. Sitte was a devoted follower of Wagner and attended the first complete performance of The Ring at Bayreuth in 1876 as a guest of his old school friend, the conductor Hans Richter. In a letter from Sitte to his friend Ferdinand van Veldegg in 1889, the architect characterized his writings, especially his main theoretical treatise, as merely supporting efforts and training for his planned National-Wagnerisch creative works. George and Christian Collins, translators of Sitte's writings, have observed that although his magnum opus doesn't suggest it, Sitte was known to be quite a German nationalist. Wagner was not only a hero for him, but he also, in their words, patterned himself on Wagner's Germanic heroes, giving battle to the ill-informed and evilly motivated forces that repressed artistic creativity in his century. Sitte became caught up in the Wagner mania and intense German nationalism of the 1870s and penned an essay in 1875 entitled Richard Wagner and German Art. In it, he traced Wagner's longing for a union of the arts in theater back to Johann Georg Sulzer's General Theory of the Fine Arts, published in the early 1770s. Sulzer, like Wagner, deplored the current spiritual and intellectual spirit in German-speaking lands and looked longingly to the ancient Greeks. Sulzer declared that The firm reason to establish the opera as a grand and glorious institution would be its precise connection with the national interest of an entire people. But this cannot be in our times, for the nations have never been as far removed as they are today from the spirit that ruled in Athens and Rome, and by means of which the public spectacles, especially Greek tragedy, which was essentially an opera, became essential components of political and religious celebrations. Zolzer continued, "We wish to speak of improvements that could be made to opera according to the present state of the fine arts. In order for this to happen, it would be necessary for a great prince, beloved by the muses, to give a man all that was needed to stage the spectacle, a man who, with good will and much taste, also had a superb reputation, by means of which he would be capable of guiding the poet, composer, and all of the virtuosi necessary for the opera according to his fancy." So perhaps anticipating Ludwig II. Zolzer also extolled the combined power of the arts that might be realized in a theatrical spectacle, as had many Baroque thinkers. Sitte then named Wagner specifically as the great artist who was to unite the arts for modern German culture. In fact, he says, "The Festspielhaus already stands in Bayreuth, and we experience living and incarnate before our very eyes the artwork that has long been prepared and anticipated." Sitte then turns to German history and myth and stresses its importance as the foundation of the German artwork of the future. The focal point of this German artwork of the future, Sitte says, cannot be Apollo, the beautiful man, nor Christ, the suffering man, but only Siegfried, the strong man. The free Siegfried of our time, he who killed the giant because he provoked him, who forged his own sword and smashed Wotan's runic spear into pieces because he wanted to resist him, and who compelled Brunhilde himself in spite of Wotan's ring of fire. Sitte then naturally labels Wagner as a second Siegfried and acclaims the composer as the reviver of modern German art. Wagner has taken the old German myths, he says, and filed them down to their basic components and then cast and forged them anew, as Siegfried forges his sword. Sitte compares this reawakening of Germanic myth with those in the Siegfried legend and also in the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. He says, "There, Sleeping Beauty awakens from 100-year-long sleep. Here, German myth awakens from more than 1,000 years of slumber. There, it is the kiss of the suitor. Here, the song of the love poet that works this wonder, that sings the native myth to life for us. And that is the meaning of Richard Wagner for German art." This is how he ends his essay. Sitte was clearly a firm Wagnerite and hoped to transform Vienna through the ideas that he espoused in Der Städtebau, but was unsuccessful. He made proposals for improvements to the Ringstrasse project, which included creating public squares in front of major buildings and creating, in Karl Schorschke's formulation, islands of human community in the cold sea of traffic-dominated space. Though these proposals were not adopted, his theories were perpetuated as his treatise was translated into French in 1902, Russian in 1925, Spanish in 1926, English for the first time in 1945, and Italian in 1953. As Andrew Hirscher has noted, Sitte's book was specifically directed at Vienna, the imperial capital, but also assumed a universal relevance. So 3 broad elements expressed in Der Städtebau link this architect with romantic thought. 1, praise for ancient cities that had grown organically over many centuries, that is, they had expanded in harmony with natural features, rather than having a grid system artificially imposed on them. 2, his advocacy of bringing nature into the city through added green space. And 3, the view of urban design as a total work of art, or perhaps a modern replacement or substitute for that total work of art that might still come in the future, because it impacted urban planning, impacted great numbers of people on a daily basis. So I will explore each of these in a little bit more detail now. By praising the character of medieval towns and cities that had retained a sense of their pre-industrial character, Sitte opposed himself to the modern grid system of city planning, perhaps most evident today in Manhattan. City planning from antiquity through the Renaissance, in his opinion, was an artistic enterprise, but he says it is only in our mathematical century that the process of enlarging and laying out cities has become an almost purely technical concern. One of the major purposes of his treatise was to demonstrate that artistic matters were at least as important as technical concerns in urban design. In Appendix number 2 of Der Städtebau, published in a subsequent edition in 1904, Sitte declared that the urban planner must break radically with the traditional stereotype of geometric street layouts and allow the greatest possible flexibility in details. Curved streets should be embraced, along with diverse widths of streets and sidewalks. Cities should each have a completely unique character determined by location, history, and ethnic influences. He says that nature and art, historical wisdom and fresh, effervescent life should always go hand in hand, so that dry, tedious patterns may be dispensed with, and once more each town can achieve a unique character in its layout and architecture in keeping with its location and ethnic idiosyncrasies. Every new town the world over need not end up with the identical monotony of appearance, as if stamped out by the same mechanical mold. So, in other words, cities should be allowed to grow and adapt to changing conditions over time, almost like a living creature, rather than having the straitjacket of the grid system imposed upon them. Sitte echoed the love for curvilinear shapes that was advocated by theorist John Ruskin in England, and which was such a noted element in the art of the Viennese Secession, the English arts and crafts movement, and Art Nouveau as well. The Athenian Acropolis was a model for Sitte of where what he says is a place where a people's philosophy of life becomes tangible. And he says it is not merely a part of a city plan in the usual sense, but the product of centuries evolved into a genuine work of art. But an acropolis in the modern world was impossible since, he says, we lack both the artistic basis for it and any universally valid philosophy of life that has sufficient vigor in the soul of the people to find physical expression in the work. This echoed Wagner's views on ancient Athenian drama and their unique culture and unified worldview that produced it, at least in Wagner's interpretation. Cities that had grown piece by piece over many years often featured squares that were truly works of art. Sitte says about the Piazza del Duomo in Pisa that there is nothing here to distract our attention, nothing that reminds us of the daily hustle and bustle. In contemplating the venerable facade of the cathedral, we are not annoyed by any obtrusive little tailor shop, by the confusion of a cafe, or by the shouts of drivers and porters. Peace prevails, and the totality of the effect assists our spirit to enjoy and comprehend the works of art accumulated in this place. And here's an aerial photograph of the Piazza del Duomo, which, of course, most of the time is completely filled with tourists. So, as it probably was in Sitte's time as well. So, there's that commercial element and that busy hustle and bustle element as well. So he also says on the seemingly odd choices for the placement of fountains and statues in old squares, that is not directly in the directly in the center of the square, he remarks that we are presented with a mystery, the mystery of the innate instinctive aesthetic sense that worked such obvious wonders for the old masters without resort to narrow aesthetic dogma or stuffy rules. We, on the other hand, come along afterward, scurrying about with our T-square and compass, presuming to solve with clumsy geometry those fine points that are matters of pure sensitivity. Again, the spirit of Wagner can be felt here. Wagner also chafed against rigid rules and their stifling impact on art. He sought to break free from the rigidity of the Italian number opera tradition with his music dramas and lampooned the character of Beckmesser and his rules for songwriting in Die Meistersinger, or his strict adherence to the rules, favoring instead the instinctual composing of Walter von Stolzing. Sitte's romantic inclinations also included swipes at capitalism and greed, targets of Wagner's scorn in his writings and in The Ring. Sitte characterized the manufactured product as the trademark of modernity and blamed the regular parceling of lots based on purely economic considerations for what he called the mass slaughter of the beauties of city planning. So here he's talking about the division of lots within a city, and earlier Holly Watkins talked about those who criticize the perfectly even parceling of land in the countryside. So a very interesting comparison between thinkers around the same time talking about geometric rigidity and resisting that. So Sitte also mentions briefly the United States. He remarks that the division of this country into states, often along straight lines, was due to what he calls America's lack of a history, its uncertain future, and its lack of a well-known terrain. He says, quote, wherever people are concerned merely with colonizing land, live only for earning money, and earn money only in order to live, it may be appropriate to pack people into blocks of buildings like herring in a barrel, but obviously not in Europe. So, nice view of Americans there. Many Romantic artists, including Wagner, emphasize the importance of nature in their work. Whether depicted as menacing, as in the Wolfsglen scene from Weber's Der Freischütz, or peaceful, as in the forest murmurs from Wagner's Siegfried, nature often played a major role in 19th century art. Sitte devoted an entire appendix in Der Städtebau to what he called greenery within the city. He began that appendix by noting that our ancestors since time immemorial were forest dwellers. We are apartment house dwellers. This alone suffices to explain the irresistible craving for nature on the part of the residents of cities. It explains why for townspeople, in their longing for nature, each tree, every little patch of grass, every flower pot is something sacred. The city that best expressed his ideal of urban greenery was Istanbul in Turkey, which he called by its former name Constantinople. The miracle of green space within large masses of buildings in that city was a result of natural processes. I've included here a little aerial view of part of the oldest section of Istanbul, down near some of the major mosques and historical buildings. So it may not be extremely easy to see, but very curving streets, not a perfect rigid grid layout, and lots of trees as well, a lot of the darker patches in between the lighter bits of buildings there. He says that in Constantinople, since time immemorial, vegetation grew naturally and was removed only when it disturbed the effect. Where it could still be found, it was right, natural, and perfect. He opposed the creation of broad boulevards with imported greenery, especially trees planted in perfectly straight rows, as in on the Ringstrasse in Vienna, for example, or Unter den Linden in Berlin. This is a bit of the Ringstrasse right by the University of Vienna at the lower left of the screen. Just above that is the Votivkirche with its triangular plaza that he was very critical of. Now, obviously, there's a street cutting right through there, right in front of the neo-Gothic Votivkirche. So he didn't get to realize his plans for altering this plaza, and now there's a street running right through the middle of it. So he opposed the creation of broad boulevards with imported greenery, again favoring smaller islands of natural growth within the concrete jungle. Sitte also reflected Wagnerian aesthetics through his characterization of the city as a total work of art. In the final appendix to Der Städtebau, he remarked that city planning represented what he called the fusion of all the technical and creative arts into a great and integrated whole. He also used the terms Gesamtwerk and Gesamtkunstwerk in relation to cities in his treatise. After elaborating his views on the role of greenery within the city, he concluded that city planning was no mere mechanical office task, but an important and inspired work of art. This understanding of city planning, an essential part of the great and true art of the people, was vital in the modern world because he says that his age lacked just such a popular synthesizing of all the visual arts in the name of an all-encompassing and unified national work of art, Nationales Gesamtkunstwerk. Wagner advocated the Gesamtkunstwerk as ideally the work of many artists, yet maintained strict control over all aspects of his own works. Likewise, Sitte hoped that individual artists, rather than committees of planners or politicians, would direct the shaping of modern cities. On the impossibility of achieving a good city plan through committee work, he wrote that Through official channels, one cannot design a monumental church building or paint a historical scene or compose a symphony. Works of art cannot be created by a committee or through office activity, but only by a single individual. An artistically effective city plan is also a work of art and not merely an administrative matter. This is the crux of the whole situation. The cities that great individuals would design must incorporate various arts because city planning formatively affected the great mass of the population every day and every hour, whereas he says that theater and concerts were available only to the wealthier classes. Sitte thus strove to create cities that would essentially function as large-scale works of art. Although Sitte is never mentioned by name, at least as far as I've been able to determine so far, the modern slow food and slow city movements show an affinity for his glorification of traditional culture and attempts to imbue modern urban life with an artistic sentiment. The range of modern attempts to slow the pace of life and preserve cultural traditions is often referred to as the slow movement. In his 2004 book, In Praise of Slowness, Challenging the Cult of Speed, journalist Carl Honore differentiates the philosophies of fast and slow. Fast to him is busy, controlling, aggressive, hurried, analytical, stressed, superficial, impatient, active, quantity over quality. Slow, on the other hand, is calm, careful, receptive, still, intuitive, unhurried, patient, reflective, quality over quantity. It is also, he says, about making real and meaningful connections with people, culture, work, food, everything. He says that Italy may be the closest thing the slow movement has to a spiritual home because of the emphasis on pleasure and relaxation in the traditional Mediterranean way of life. And most of the cities that Sitte praised in his treatise happen to be in Italy. The most recognized organization within the movement is Slow Food, which was founded in 1989 in response to the spread of American fast food chains in Italy. Slow Food is headquartered in the town of Bra near Turin and has member organizations in 150 countries around the world. Since the late 80s, other slow movements have emerged, including Slow City, Città Slow, slow music, and even slow sex, though none of these has managed to make the same impact as has Slow Food. For one reason or another. According to its website, Slow Food was founded to counter the rise of fast food and fast life, the disappearance of local food traditions, and people's dwindling interest in the food they eat, where it comes from, how it tastes, and how our food choices affect the rest of the world. Just as Sitte stressed the uniqueness of each city center or town square and the importance of adapting city planning to local geographic features, Slow Food seeks to preserve local identity by, in their words, protecting traditional and sustainable quality foods and maintaining the diversity of regional food and agricultural traditions. The wisdom of local communities can help to protect the ecosystems that surround them and offer sustainable prospects for the future. The Slow Food Manifesto, written by Folco Portinari in 1989, reads in many ways like an anti-futurist manifesto, speaking in terms of the Italian movement that glorified machines and speed in the early 20th century. It states in part that, born and nurtured under the sign of industrialization, this century invented the machine and then modeled its lifestyle after it. Speed became our shackles. We fell prey to the same virus, the fast life that fractures our customs and assails us even in our own homes, forcing us to ingest fast food. So, in other words, we need to escape from this cycle by embracing slow food. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the slow city movement in conclusion. In 2010, the Norwegian motivational speaker Geir Bertelsen wrote in an opinion piece on CNN.com that psychologists tell us that a person's basic needs are belonging, care, and love. To fulfill these needs, we have to accept that we are not rats and life is not a race. These values can only be reached if you have slowness in human relations. History teaches us that unplanned urbanization causes negative consequences for people in cities. To create great cities, we need to promote human interaction based on basic human values. These values can only come through slowness, again, in human relations. The most visible organization devoted to such goals is the Slow City movement, founded in 1999 and inspired by the Slow Food movement. It is headquartered in Orvieto, Italy, and certifies towns and small cities with no more than 50,000 inhabitants as slow cities. To be certified, they have to commit to honoring a list of 55 pledges or working towards fulfilling them. in the Citaslo Manifesto, and of course pay their annual fee to the organization, naturally, of course. These pledges include cutting noise and traffic, increasing green spaces and pedestrian zones, backing local farmers, and the shops, markets, and restaurants that sell their produce, and fostering a spirit of hospitality and neighborliness. But like slow food, Citaslo embraces the best of both tradition and modern technology. And as an example, the city of Bra, home headquarters of slow food, they have closed some streets to traffic, banned supermarket chains and lurid neon signs, in Carl Honore's wording, while granting the best commercial real estate to small family-run businesses, subsidizing building renovations using local materials, closing small shops on Thursdays and Sundays in keeping with Italian tradition. So Honore says that for many in the slow city movement, the urban ideal is the late medieval city, a rabbit warren of cobbled streets where people come together to shop, socialize, and eat in charming piazzas. So like a lot of the towns that Sitte praised in his treatise. But of course, Honore says, these are the sort of places most of us will ever only see on holiday. So not cities that most of us live in ordinarily. Okay, so finally, and here's a few image of Orvieto, a couple images. Again, the snail motif in their logo. Richard Wagner's music, dramas, and theories inspired artists and intellectuals in many different fields, not the least of which was architecture. His own son Siegfried studied architecture and considered a career in the field at one point in his life. Sitte's veneration of Wagner was reflected in many of the ideas expressed in his city planning treatise. The longing for community, the improvement of the quality of life, and the enrichment of society through art during an era of mass production united Wagner, Sitte, and many reformers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their hopes live on, in part, through those active in the modern slow movement. Although many of Wagner's most grandiose plans were never realized, and Sitte's hopes for improving Vienna remained on paper, many within the slow movements mix a healthy dose of pragmatism with their utopian dreaming. Wagner, of course, had to embrace pragmatism as well to get his music dramas staged in an ideal manner. They seek to take the best of the fast life and modern capitalism and blend it with the traditional and the slow to try and improve modern living one step at a time. So is slow living, or the slow philosophy, an inherently Wagnerian way of living? Perhaps, perhaps not. But Wagner created some of the most complex and philosophically rich works in the operatic repertoire, and his Bioriod festivals were designed to immerse theatergoers in a peaceful environment secluded from the temptations of big cities. This would allow more time for relaxation and focusing on the works being staged over the course of several days, providing ample opportunity to ponder their full meaning. The socialist fervor of many of Wagner's theoretical writings has been tempered by modern pragmatism within the slow movement, but the hope for a better world lives on. Now, if we can only develop slow music, whatever that might really mean, so that it will imply more than just playing classical masterworks at slower tempi. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over.
We'll make adjustments. I think there will probably be some questions. Yes, for Stephen, a very interesting paper. Ed? Wait for the microphone. But
Thank you for a really fascinating paper and something that, frankly, I've not heard explored at a Wagner conference before. I wanted to ask you a question about Sitte's work, and I'll tell you the context. Let me first ask the question.
Okay, sure.
Did you find evidence in Sitte's writings that he was consciously having as part of his agenda the facilitation of sanitation in the great cities? And I'll tell you why I ask it and why I ask it at a Wagner conference. And that is that at the same period, Munich and Berlin were considered the cleanest cities in Europe, with disease rates that were far lower than they were in other places. This was the height of the sanitation movement, and there was this constant tension at that time between the experimentalists in medicine, who thought the solution was, frankly, vivisection and more experimentation on animals, and the public health camp that felt, no, the solution to control for disease was, let's clean up our urban environments. Wagner was clearly in the camp of the latter, of the public health movement, the sanitation movement. Mm-hmm. What about Sitte? Because it seems that from what I've read of Sitte and what you've described of Sitte, the creation of space, the creation of repose, the creation of wider alleys, all of that should improve sanitation. Well, was that a conscious effort on his part? And if so, that would be another connection, perhaps a more subtle one, but another connection between him and Wagner.
He talks about sanitation, public sanitation, in his treatise in several spots. I know in the Greenery Within the City appendix, he talks specifically about how each apartment building complex should have a spacious interior courtyard. He preferred these types of green areas over city parks that were just kind of thrown down in the middle of a major traffic intersection or next to where a lot of traffic passed by because of air quality and noise especially. So he talked a lot about the importance of trees and quiet green areas within living spaces. He talks about how city planning in general should always take heed of the importance of good sanitation. He doesn't give a lot of specifics about how that might be realized in terms of sewer systems and things of that nature, but that was something that was definitely one of the issues that was important to integrate into all of his city planning ideas. Yeah, go.
Jim, you have a... Oh, Yvonne, sorry.
Sorry, thanks. I have two questions, and one is about Sitte's sources, and one is about Sitte as a source. And the first is, you mentioned Ruskin in passing, but it seems to me, in a lot of what you read out, it sounds to echo, it seems to me as if it echoes really, really strongly the Stones of Venice from the early 1850s. So I was wondering to what extent he's borrowing very heavily from Ruskin in a lot of his praise of the late medieval, the organic city, as Ruskin would also think of it. So Ruskin as a source is one question. The other question might be a little bit more obscure, but I don't know if you're familiar with the Kunstschau 1908. In 1908, there was a Kunstschau organized in Vienna by Klimt and his circle.
I'm aware of it, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and Joseph Hoffmann, people like that. They saw this month-long, like it lasted for about 6 months, this exhibit. They saw it as a Gesamtkunstwerk. With everything, with all the arts, both displayed and performed, with a garden, with architecture, and so on and so forth.
And the famous Beethoven exhibition at the Secession
exactly,
also.
Happening at the same time. Is there? Would you draw a line between? I mean, no, he dies in 1903, but is Sitte to some extent someone who contributes to their idea, to Klimt and his circle's idea of what a Gesamtkunstwerk is, or is he just one of, like, what would be his influence in their wanting to have a Gesamtkunstwerk that looked like that in 1908?
To go to your first question about Ruskin, Sitte does talk a bit about Venice and the beauties of the Piazza San Marco and the Piazzetta next to it, saying that it's probably the most beautiful place on earth in terms of urban design because of the balance of all the different architectural features, the proper, what he calls proportion. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but everything is in balance. He mentions the rich polychromy of the Basilica of San Marco, which I believe is something that Ruskin emphasizes in the Stones of Venice as well, talking about polychromy and blending of different colors in architecture. So I'm fairly certain that Sitte was aware of Ruskin and probably had read some of his writings. I assume they would have been, some of it at least would have been translated into German. I'm not positive, but he does mention polychromy. No, that's how it's been translated, at least into English. So I assume he would be aware of Ruskin's ideas, at least tangentially. In terms of the Kunstschau and those exhibitions, I'm not fully aware of how much influence he might have exerted over many of the leading artists there. I mean, he was a painter himself. That's something I should look a little bit closer into. Obviously, a lot of those artists were inspired by Wagner as well, the Gesamtkunstwerk idea. But the fact that Sitte was an architect and a painter also may very well have had an influence there. That's something I will look more closely into. Thank you.
One more, Sana? Okay.
Just as far as that this kind of idea would be influenced by Wagner, I'd like to call attention to Wilhelm Heinrich Riehl, who in the 1850s had a very anti-modern approach also about architecture in the city, and bemoaned how these train stations were being built that were all the same, and that we were having, he didn't say grid, but it was going to be like these kind of, everything was starting to look alike, and he hated Wagner.
Oh, really? That's it. Yeah, that's so obviously not everyone who was a Wagnerite was also against mass production and like the standardization of architectural design. Thank you, yeah, for that comment. That's something to definitely take into account as well. And that's kind of mid-19th century, you said?
Yeah, so I think that this anti-modern approach to architecture and the urban landscape goes back earlier.
Oh, surely,
Yeah,
yes. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen, for a really wonderful paper, and we'll
Thank you.